evening, everyone. As everybody is filtering in, we just want to say thank you so much for joining us on this chilly Thursday evening to learn a bit about how we can support youth by addressing anxiety and school refusal. We have some awesome presenters here today. This work is being supported by the Munroe-Meyer Guild in a project that is just aiming to support families and supporting youth with mental and behavioral health concerns. This series is also being offered in collaboration with the School-Based Mental Health Collaborative, and our presentations are going to be delivered monthly. So definitely keep your eyes peeled for future presentations. These are the upcoming dates and topics that we are going to be having. Up next is on March 22nd, where we're going to be talking through executive functioning and study skills with Dr. Simone Moody, who's based out of Mercy Children's in Kansas City. And then we also will be talking about supporting youth with depression on April 20th and supporting social skill development and peer conflict on May 16th. All right, here are our awesome panelists. We have some brief bios here just so you can get to know them a little bit more. Dr. Reeve is a pediatric psychologist with Children's Behavioral Health. She received her PhD in clinical psychology from Western Michigan University in 2014. Dr. Reeve completed her internship and postdoctoral fellowship through the Munroe-Meyer Institute's Department of Psychology, and was an assistant professor at MMI for 2 years prior to transitioning to her current role with Children's Behavioral Health. Her areas of treatment focus include providing cognitive behavioral therapy for a variety of behavioral and emotional concerns, including oppositional defiant disorder, ADHD, anxiety, and depression. And Dr. Reeve is joined with Dr. Ackley, who is originally from Mississippi, where she gained her PhD in school psychology and became a board-certified behavior analyst. She has been providing behavioral psychological services since 2015, and she currently works as a psychology fellow at Omaha Children's Behavioral Health. She regularly consults with children and families to provide caregiver training on behavioral strategies and assess children for ADHD and autism. Thank you so much, Dr. Reeve and Dr. Ackley, for joining us here today. All right, I'm going to pass it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you for that lovely intro. Appreciate it. All right, so to give you a heads up about what to expect throughout our time together this evening, first, we'll go over some basics of anxiety and the prevalence of those presentations, and then what to consider across developmental stages as far as what's typical or what's considered normal for certain age groups, and then things to kind of watch out for that might be less uncommon or less common, and then going into what are some diagnoses that can occur with anxiety or look like anxiety. And then Dr. Reeve will get into school refusal basics and what are some causes and signs to look out for school refusal, and then how to manage those behaviors whenever they occur. And then, as Dr. Young mentioned, we'll get into some questions and answers. And for those of you who submitted some questions early on whenever you were registering, we do have a couple of those that we'll answer, and then we'll get into the questions that you submit as well. So in 2016, there was a national survey of children's health that was completed by caregivers, just to get an idea of what was the US prevalence of children with anxiety. And they looked at kids ages 3 through 17 years old, and they found that about 7% of kids in the US had a current anxiety problem. And so that looks like about 4.5 million kids. And then, as expected, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the estimates nearly doubled. And we're on the lookout for right now as far as, have they leveled out a little bit? Are they still in the process of being leveled out? But I would assume the latter, we're still in the process, because we still have a lot of health things going on as well that kids can become anxious about. And some common presentations of anxiety that you might hear about and what they might look like, especially for kids, are social anxiety, and that can get into affecting their academic performance. So if you think about if a kid has to do a presentation in front of the classroom, that can be really nerve-wracking. And whenever you have those nerves associated with that performance, then that can affect your grade. Or even if other kids are turning in their tests before them, they're worried about that judgment. Oh my gosh, am I doing something wrong? Should I be turning it in earlier? And then into that social performance that we talk about. Are they worried about being judged in that social interaction component of it whenever they're chatting with their friends, and how they might look in terms of comparing themselves to friends as well? And then getting into selective mutism, that can look like only speaking in certain environments or only speaking to certain people. A lot of times whenever I've seen kids come in with selective mutism, they might only speak to mom or only speak to dad or in the home environment, because it's really anxiety provoking for them to try and figure out, how do I talk to these other new people? What do I do here? And then with the panic symptoms, that looks like a lot of what people think of whenever we think of anxiety. So that may look like heart racing, that difficulty breathing, some sweating even, and feeling nauseous or dizzy. And I think it's also important to remember that some kids might express their worries by getting angry at situations as well, and having difficulties regulating their emotions too. So outwardly, there can be different presentations. And then you can also look like trouble sleeping or sleeping too much from being burnt out from their worries, especially after long school days. And then with a presentation of OCD or OCD-like symptoms, that can look like a lot of intrusive thoughts. And those intrusive thoughts can lead to a lot of stress and anxiety. So if you have this intrusive thought of, I have to do this thing, and then you're not able to do it, or you're not able to complete those things, then you get those symptoms like the heart racing and difficulty breathing, or those intrusive thoughts start repeating. And then, as with anything, you have to consider the trauma component as well, and how, for instance, if someone has a history of being physically or verbally threatened or harmed, then they might have trouble performing in a social setting because they have this negative association with other people in their lives. And so they really worry about how they're going to perform socially, or there's just a lack of trust. And so new environments can be really hard. And then getting into other presentations and behaviors that you might see, which we'll get into even more later, is that school avoidance and refusal. So you can be worried about your school day or worried about the judgment. You can be worried about how you're going to perform on that test. And that can lead to refusing to go to school, avoiding going to school, skipping school. And then we've also found that for kids with ADHD and autism, there's an increased likelihood of school avoidance and refusal as well. And Dr. Reed will get into that a little bit later. And then it's also important to consider that there may be other things going on, as far as it might look like anxiety, but it may be in part due to an intellectual disability, depression, ADHD, or other diagnoses, but the symptoms present themselves as worrying behaviors. So for instance, harkening back to that 2016 study, about 3.2% of US children had depression, and then about 7.4% had a behavioral or conduct problem as well. And then you can also think about, well, is this anxiety related to a specific subject? So that might be a concern to look into a specific learning disability as well. And then there can also be more than one diagnosis at play, right? For children with anxiety, more than 37% of them also had behavior problems. And then another 32% of children with anxiety also had depression. And then in fact, on top of that, kids who have depression, they're even more likely to have anxiety as well. So the gist is, it's important to not think about those things in a vacuum, and that multiple things can be influencing those anxiety symptoms. Two other questions to consider are, what is normal or what is typical for a student of this age, and what is typical for this particular student or this particular child? So getting into that, when kids are toddlers, it's very, very common for them to have a fear of the dark. It's dark out there, they don't know what's in the dark, and maybe it's a monster under the bed, they don't know, and that's pretty common. But what is not common is just this sense of terror, and they just can't be soothed or distracted from it, no matter what you do. It's really, really difficult to help soothe them. And then when you get into preschool, it, again, still pretty common for them to have a fear of the dark. And then some stranger danger, a lot of people call it. That's really common, especially whenever you think about preschoolers. It's their first time going to school for a lot of kids. So they're thinking, I don't know about this. I'm used to home life, whatever that is, and getting along with these new people sounds kind of scary. So it's normal for them to worry about that. And then if they're still having that terror, that's really difficult to be soothed or distracted. That's also less common. And then also that refusal to speak. And that might get into a selective mutism diagnosis, it might not, but just the motivation isn't there or the skill isn't there. It's really difficult for them to speak for whatever reason in an environment is less common. And then getting into the school age from 5 years old up until adolescence, that fear of the dark is starting to lessen. So they've had enough time to think, okay, there's not going to be a monster underneath my bed. I can kind of rationalize this a little bit in their heads. Like, I've looked under there, there's no monster under there. And then getting into some sort of awareness of death as well. That doesn't mean they totally understand the topic, but for a lot of kids, they'll first encounter this with a pet dying is pretty common. And just some awareness of people aren't here forever, animals aren't here forever. And then it's really, really common for kids to have some sort of fear of safety or health considerations, like if someone is hurt or sick, then they worry about them, or they worry about themselves, like, am I going to get better? Is this thing that I'm taking going to make me feel better? That's very common. And then less so common, again, from 5 years up until adolescence. They should be able to sleep in their own bed. And if they're not, then that might be an indication of some sort of fear of the dark. That might be an indication of so many other things could be going on. And then also kids will be kids. Like, you don't expect them to follow every direction that you have as far as compliance or refusing things. But overall, if they typically kind of follow directions, then that's what you would expect. But if you were to give them across the day 10 directions and they're very unlikely to follow those, then that needs to be looked into a little bit. That could be so many different things. It could be, are they comprehending what you're asking them to do? Are they able to parse out the different demands that you're asking of them? Maybe you need to do like smaller demands first instead of multiple step ones. And then also it's atypical for them to just have these fears that they cannot get their mind off of, or they're repeatedly asking questions about things. Like if, for instance, you have a doctor's appointment a week from now, and every day they're just asking, what do I do with the doctor? Are they going to give me a shot? Are they going to do this? And just so many questions about it. And they're just really, really worried about this instance of going to the doctor. Then that's getting into the uncommon territory, or things that you might want to think about. What are the causes of those? And then getting into the adolescent time period, our favorite time period in all of our lives, right? It's really common for teens to worry about how they're fitting into the world, and are their peers judging them? Are they doing the right thing? And trying to balance the expectations of themselves and their home life and school life and how they fit into their own culture, and really trying to figure out how they fit into the world overall. Very common to worry about those sorts of things. But then when you get into some somatic symptoms that result in school or activity avoidance or any sort of avoidance, where they have those somatic symptoms where they're getting nauseous, they're getting dizzy. Some kids might even be so worried that they start gagging or they throw up even. So those are instances that you might want to start worrying about or look into and figure out what the causes are. And again, those perseverant fears. And a lot of times they just feel like their worries are bigger than they are, and they have this sense that they can't control the worries. And then some general approaches for anxiety are going to be some sort of psychoeducation on our body's fear response in that fight, flight, or freeze, and how with anxiety, our body is essentially saying, I'm really worried about this thing, and it gets into that survival mode and you kind of have to rewire your brain and doing the opposite and teaching yourself in your body that, okay, I have this fear response, I have this shakiness, I have the shortness of breath and the heart racing, and my body feels like it's in danger, but that doesn't mean I'm actually in danger. So trying to teach the body and the mind that distress does not equate danger is trying to do the opposite of whatever your anxiety is trying to tell you to do. So say your anxiety says, I cannot interact with anyone. So try and take small steps towards interacting with people, and that can help de-stress yourself. And that can look like, hey, I'm a little bit closer in footage to this person. I'm taking a couple closer steps towards a person, and then I might, hang out beside them, and then I might make a comment to them, and gradually getting into that. And part of the gradual approach that's so huge is having a collaboration part of that with the kid as much as possible, especially whenever they get older, and talking through, what are you comfortable with? Where can we start? And really making them feel supported. And then with little kids, that can look like, hey, what do you want to work for? Do you want to work for this or this? And having that choice and some sense of control can be really, really helpful. And essentially, you're doing your best to prevent that escape and avoidance of whatever is making them worry. And then also, because anxiety makes you want to avoid things, you can work on earning escape as well. So, hey, you gradually took a step towards talking to someone today, so you can go ahead and take a break from socializing for a little bit. And that contingent reinforcement can look like access to a break. It can be some sort of reward system. They can earn some toy or activity. It can look like a lot of different things. And some things that teachers and students can do in collaboration with caregivers as well. Teachers can help by noticing differences in behaviors, or if they know in collaboration with the caregiver, what are some triggers that might be difficult for the student? And because if they encounter that trigger, then they're more likely to engage in some worrying behaviors, or they might be more likely to avoid a situation. And you and the teachers can use your attention strategically by, for instance, they have a hard time getting up in front of the classroom, and they did it that day. So you can use your attention by saying, I noticed that you got in front of the class today, dude. Awesome job. I know that can be really hard for you, but you did it. I'm so proud of you. And having that positive appreciation can go so many miles. And then also helping the the child, evaluate, have they met their basic needs that day? Because if you haven't met your basic needs, then it's going to be an increased likelihood that things are harder for you. So have you eaten today? What did your sleep look like? And you can empower students to have the checklist and take that inventory themselves. And whenever they do, then you can give them an incentive for making sure that they have prepared for things. And you can talk through those triggers with them and talk through, okay, so we know that whenever you start getting worried, you might rock back and forth a little bit. So that might be your indication that you need to start doing some deep breathing. And then if that doesn't work, then having a plan to reach out to the school counselor or make an appointment with a psychologist or somebody to see outside of school. But it's important to have some sort of plan. And then that way they just don't feel lost, because having a plan can be really comforting. But overall, some really important considerations are to ensure the student's safety. So having that plan and making them feel encouraged to be a part of that plan. And also, I think it's really important for there to be that collaboration between school and caregivers as much as possible. So we all know what's going on and what might be helpful. It might also be helpful for caregivers to seek services in psychology, just to have even further support. And a huge one is always going to be that escape feels so good whenever you're worried about something and you just avoid or escape the situation entirely. There's this huge sense of relief, like, oh, I don't have to deal with it anymore. This feels so nice. I feel so relieved right now. But that relief is temporary because you're not actively engaging in the things that are worrying you. And whenever you continue to avoid, then that just makes the anxiety worse, unfortunately. And Dr. Reeve will get into why that's important with school refusal.
All right, so I am going to continue on with the topic of school refusal. And the reason that we're talking about school refusal in combination with the topic of anxiety is the two of these areas are very strongly linked. What we know is that school refusal isn't a formal diagnosis, so you couldn't get diagnosed with school refusal. But what we do know is that we have a high level of distress about attending school. So we may be, sad, we may be angry, we may have tantrum behaviors. So there's just a really big reaction to attending school. So that's one part of school refusal. The other part could be just a difficulty staying at school or getting to school for an entire school day. So when we're talking about the concept of school refusal, that's what we're talking about. School refusal occurs in between 2 and 5% of all school-age children, and the rate is similar between boys and girls, so not a whole lot of gender differences. It's most common between the ages of 5 and 6. Which if we think about this age period, we're talking about, transition to kindergarten. And so we know that, that is a really big change in terms of structure, routine, just daily life changes a lot when we enter kindergarten. School refusal then, might taper off after we adjust to kindergarten, elementary school, and then come back at around ages 10 and 11 when we have that transition to middle school. So a good takeaway is that we want to be watching for a child's reaction during transition periods for sure. And there are no socioeconomic differences in the research on school refusal. So really, I think sometimes when we talk about school refusal, truancy might also come to mind. And by truancy, this is kind of the opposite, where with school refusal, the parent knows, okay, I'm gonna, call my kiddo in because they're not wanting to go to school today for whatever reason. Maybe we're complaining of a, stomach ache, headache, those kinds of things. Whereas truancy, like you may not even know where your child is because they're skipping school and those kinds of things. So today we're focusing, more on school refusal and anxiety associated with attending school. Now that we know what we're talking about when we're talking about school refusal, we'll talk about what the progression looks like with school refusal. Typically, the onset is gradual, so we might miss one day of school here and there, and then we might then, a little while later, miss another handful of days until we have accumulated absences without, true physical illness or need to stay home from school. Some kids, as I was saying before, we may have that anxiety, that sadness, that I'm worried about what's going to happen at school. I'm worried about being separated from my parent. So, it may be expressed that way. It may be expressed through, just tearfulness, sadness, tantrums. So we can see a wide variety of just behavioral and emotional reactions when a child is attempting to not go to school. Another really common thing that's, we see in kids who refuse to go to school at times are physical complaints. So we're complaining of headaches, we're complaining of stomach aches, those kinds of physical complaints in order to be able to avoid going to school. But if we let the child stay home, magically, sometimes then maybe an hour later, they're good to go. They're back to their same energy level. Maybe they're wanting to play or be active. And so the physical complaints oftentimes magically disappear, shortly afterwards, if we're seeing school refusal as a possibility of what's going on. In terms of timing as well, we really want to pay attention to breaks from school. So this most recent winter break, sometimes, the kids when they're returning to school might have, some of these, worries or physical complaints happening because we got out of the routine of school, and then we're having to adjust all over again. And not even just breaks from school, but even maybe I was sick for a few days and it was really hard to get back to school. Stressors with family or friends can also be a common reason that a child might want to stay home from school. So maybe they're not getting along with their best friend very well, or maybe something's stressful is going on with a family member. So, the tricky thing about school refusal is that it can look very different from one child to the next. This next slide is just showing some of the common warning signs for school refusal. And as in the previous slide, I talked about, being absent from school or just not having the greatest attendance. If we start to see a pattern with that, we definitely want to pay attention. We also might start to see a trend in terms of absences on specific school days. So maybe if there's a big math test, or I've got to do a presentation in front of my class, or I've got to, run the mile in PE. There are certain trends that we can focus on so that maybe if there's anxiety about a certain thing that's happening at school, an event that's happening at school, that we can be proactive and potentially address that. So if we can get the child to school, then sometimes what we see are frequent requests to go to the nurse's office or to go home. So if we start getting a lot of phone calls home, that's a sign that we might be struggling with school refusal. And then kind of linked to all of this is sometimes it's hard to even get out of the house in the morning with a child that's struggling with school refusal. So, it's hard to get moving for the day. And then even in addition, maybe it's hard to get out of the car or to walk into school. So if there's any sort of avoidance repetitively related to school, school refusal could certainly be a cause. So more on the causes, and this will get a little bit more specific here. So what really sets off school avoidance is when something is going on within the school environment that the child wants to escape. And when we escape, so we don't go to school, what happens is that the anxiety just grows because we're avoiding the environment that is causing the worry to happen. So if we stay home because of the worry, then the snowball starts to happen of like, well, that felt really good to stay home and not be worried anymore. So I need to do that again tomorrow because I just can't do it again. So we get the accumulated absences, which then can cause academic challenges and then maybe cause some tension with teachers or, maybe some social problems. And so if we don't notice maybe soon enough and start to be proactive soon enough, some of these problems can accumulate. But specifically, school environments can be one of the causes of school refusal. So, I spoke a little earlier about test taking. Sometimes kids do have a lot of anxiety about taking tests, and maybe some of the performance anxiety might be impacting their desire to go to school. Sometimes it's, the physical environment itself, like the cafeteria, where it may be loud or noisy or chaotic. And even like school bathrooms can be a pretty big challenge for kids as well who have maybe sensory sensitivities. So automatic toilets, going to the bathroom, with other people in the room, like those kinds of things can be a cause for anxiety too. So we want to make sure that there's nothing environmentally at the school that might be causing the problems. Escape from social situations. So maybe, like I said, we are having a problem with a friend or a teacher, and so we're doing anything and everything we can to avoid those people rather than maybe testing out if our thoughts were, not correct, and were trying to lead us into avoiding a situation that maybe, didn't even need to make us feel anxious in the first place. Separation anxiety, again, typically this is with the younger kiddos where they may be fearing that something bad might happen to a parent, or that if they're not with their parents, something bad might happen. And so they have difficulties maybe even getting out of the car and into the school building. So separation anxiety can be an underlying cause of school refusal. And then there are a subset of kids who really are reaching out for their parent attention at times and maybe want to be spending more time with their parents. So we may have some, emotional behaviors or physical complaints in order to be able to get more time or interaction attention from parents. I wanted to talk specifically about two different diagnoses that have a really high association with anxiety. The first one is ADHD. And so what we know is that ADHD and anxiety occur together either up to a quarter or a third of the time. That's a really large amount of kids that are struggling with both attention span issues, hyperactivity, impulsivity, plus anxiety. So that's a lot, that a child has to manage, throughout a school day. And so what we see is that when we have both of these diagnoses happening together, we often see higher rates of being absent from school as well. And the reason I think that happens, and research supports this, is that when we're at school and we have symptoms of ADHD, maybe we're getting a lot of, redirection from teachers, or we're having trouble completing our work and we're having late assignments, missing assignments. So sometimes because of attentional difficulties or, being up and out of your seat or blurting or interrupting. So with these challenges, it can make school feel aversive in a lot of ways. Whereas home, typically feels a lot better, right? Maybe we can be comfortable, we feel safe, and, all of the good stuff we can do in our free time is there as well. And so school refusal sometimes happens with these kids because they're trying their hardest to be able to be in that environment that feels more comfortable to them. And so this is, a particular combination of diagnoses that we want to watch for and monitor for and be pretty proactive with. The next one that co-occurs quite often is the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder and anxiety. So those two diagnoses also happen often and are linked to school refusal as well. The difference here with autism spectrum disorder and school refusal is that the age of onset is typically a lot earlier. So we're more likely to see the school refusal happening at that kindergarten transition. And we may see it at the middle school transition as well, but we really want to be mindful of it with a transition to kindergarten for sure. There is a higher frequency, so more absences, and the absences tend to be longer, so multiple days in a row with this combination. So for kiddos on the spectrum, we definitely want to pay attention to those environmental triggers as we think back to potential causes for school refusal, because the school can be a really overwhelming place. We have maybe we have a substitute today, or maybe we have an assembly, we have transitions, we have maybe it's a music day and the sounds and music are kind of bothersome. So when we are paying attention to school refusal in a child on the spectrum, we really want to be mindful of, are there environmental factors that we can be modifying in order to help a child be at school more often. And then at home, we also may see more repetitive behaviors when feeling anxious. So we may see more stimming, more repetitive behaviors, more pacing, those kinds of things. So, just paying attention to your child's, is this different than how they would typically behave, especially related to kiddos on the spectrum. So after we've talked through, the causes, and what we kind of see as kids struggle with school refusal, now we can get to what do we do about this? So what we know is that the longer the child stays out of school, the harder it is to get back. So the more proactive we can be, the easier it is to address school refusal as an issue. Because as I was talking before, that snowball effect can get kind of overwhelming. So if we can catch the snowball when it's smaller, we can help the child feel more comfortable more quickly. And in my clinical work, I always stress, don't send a child home for the wrong reasons, especially when we're working on, that goal of being at school. And sometimes, and especially in the age of COVID, and especially this time of year with all illnesses and things going around, we do want to be cautious with health, but we also want to pay attention to patterns. So if a child is coming to, the nurse's office multiple days a week with, I have a stomach ache, I have a stomach ache. So on repeat, without a fever, without, vomiting, without diarrhea, so without true evidence of an underlying health condition, we just want to be cautious. And so once we have an idea that school refusal might be what's causing the problem, we almost want to come up with these are the only reasons that you're going to be sent home from school, so that the child knows where they can't necessarily test the limits. Just being aware of that, and I think doing some education on that is super important for parents, because sometimes it's hard to know where to hold the line, especially, when we want to be empathetic and oh my gosh, they really don't feel good. But if we start to see the pattern, we want to be careful. In addition to this knowledge, we also want to make sure that we're taking a team approach to assessment and intervening as early as we can. And so this is going to involve a lot of different people in order to make this a successful intervention. The first would be involving the child, because they're going to be able to give us the best information about what's happening, as well as their family. So we want to go to the source of who can give us the best information. We want to involve school professionals. So maybe that's the classroom teacher, principal, school counselor, school psychologist. There's a lot of different levels of intervention, we can certainly involve in a plan involving school refusal, but we just want to make sure that, the right people are there to help us out. Also, at times when we have a challenge with the physical complaints, the headaches, the stomach aches, we may even want to have the child checked out by their physician in order to be able to say, okay, no, there's nothing medical going on here, so that they can give us that reassurance. And it makes it easier for parents to be able to stick with, okay, this is the plan I should be following. So interventions, this again comes back to some of the education we were talking about. So just having those rules for this is when and how you can stay home. And the other key is If you're not at school, home is a really boring place to be. We're not going to play video games. We're not going to play with your toys. We're staying in bed, and this is going to be a pretty boring day because we want to not encourage them to stay home because home is just a more entertaining place. School is the important place to be. And just education wise as well, coming back to how a physician might be able to help, or pediatrician, if they can tell the child, like, okay, anxiety can sometimes show itself in physical ways. If you have a stomach ache, your mind and your body can trick you into having a stomach ache because you're so worried about going to school. So having a physician that can support that, as well as possibly, a behavioral health provider, because I think sometimes kids may worry because they have these physical symptoms and aren't aware that they may be caused by the anxiety itself. So again, a lot of education, and then a lot of children benefit too from therapy, specifically cognitive behavioral therapy. And this is where, again, like Dr. Ackley was speaking before, we want to expose the child to the situation that they're fearing in small ways. And so if a child is worried about, like, okay, I can't even get out of the car to be able to get into the school, we could come up with a plan where the child can get out of the car and be met by a preferred staff member. So maybe it's one of their favorite paras, or even, a classroom teacher or something, so that we're meeting the child where they're at and transitioning them from one safe person, to another safe person, just to ease their worry about transitioning into school. So there are ways like that we can be really creative in helping guide a child into doing more of the thing that's making them worried. So that's kind of the behavioral part. The cognitive part is really more related to the worries and the thoughts that we're having when we're having that anxiety. So maybe we're worried about taking a test. And so how can we have a logical, realistic thought that can help to encourage us to, I've got to go today, and I'm just going to try my best on this test today. So having those positive, logical comments that almost retrains your brain to think in a different way, which when we have the behavioral piece and the cognitive piece, this really addresses both aspects of anxiety and how it can interfere. Possibly medication. I know that this, for a lot of families, is a big deal, like even thinking about medication. And so we strongly encourage doing behavioral therapy, or working with a therapist, a counselor, psychologist, in order to try all of the strategies we can first. But sometimes medications, can be an additional support to therapy. And then parent and school intervention. So by this, I mean, what can, parents in the school actually be doing to get a child, in the building? And so really, the more information the school has, the easier it is for them to help. So the more that we can have communication, and communication early on when we start to see the pattern of school avoidance, so that parents in the school can put their heads together to try to come up with a collaborative solution that takes small steps for the child to gradually face their fears. So for example, if a child was scared to speak in front of a class, one approach that we commonly take is to almost like step up the ladder to be able to get to that final goal of speaking in front of a class, where maybe at first we'd allow them to record a presentation and turn it in. And then maybe next we're just finding a time where it can be one-on-one with the teacher and the student. And then maybe it's the teacher and a couple of friends. So you can see how we gradually push the difficulty of what we're asking the child to be comfortable with in order to eventually reach our goal. And so this is a very effective strategy in working through some of the specific reasons a child might be refusing to go to school. And even parents, I think that's something between the parents and school, but parents, trying to maybe provide positive reinforcement for school attendance. So, once we can accumulate 10 days of attending school, you can earn this motivator. Or maybe there's something small that they could earn on a daily basis, such as, you can have an extra book at bedtime or something like that. So there's a lot of ways to reinforce, attending school in a positive way. And so then once we're doing that communication, the collaboration, a lot of times, we try this informally with schools, but sometimes it gets to the level where we need some specifics in writing with the school. And that can come in terms of these additional supports, which are a 504 plan and an individualized education plan. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about these because these could actually just be a presentation on their own because there's so much that goes into these. But just awareness that these are options that you can ask your school about if you feel like we need something in writing so there's consistency across school staff. Oftentimes for kiddos with anxiety, a 504 plan is sufficient because a 504 plan doesn't require that a child needs a special education, need to qualify. So they don't have a specific learning disability or they don't, need speech therapy, anything like that. And this is, like I said, often a good fit for kids who experience anxiety because it would just lay out the plan of what the teachers do when anxiety is happening. How do we get them in the building? How do we reinforce them for their attendance? Those kinds of things can be documented in a 504 plan. Sometimes anxiety or school refusal can be wrapped up into an individualized education plan as well, or an IEP, but oftentimes that's when they have an additional qualifying condition such as autism or a learning disability. And if, it was like solely anxiety, it could fall under the category of emotional disturbance. I included a link below that gives you more information on IEPs and 504 plans if you are interested in that as well. So, and because I said, this is very brief in terms of the 504s and IEPs, I wanted to give you some resources in terms of who you can go to if you really do have more specific questions that you would like maybe an answer from outside of your school district. PTI Nebraska is one such resource, and Ask Iowa. So PTI Nebraska is solely for Nebraska, Ask Iowa is for Iowa. And essentially what these organizations do are they provide advocacy, knowledge, resources, support through the special education process. So they know the ins and outs of special education law and can be helpful when things get intense. So this is kind of the intense end of the spectrum where hopefully we can work with the school and not necessarily need additional outside advocacy through the school district. So to kind of wrap up and kind of weave all this back together, I wanted to be able to talk a little bit about what are some books, what are some resources. I know that if you go to Amazon and type in anxiety, you're going to get like a ton of options. And so these are options that I really like. I'm going to flip to the next slide because I like the pictures a little better. But on the previous slide, that's just the titles and authors. The first couple are for younger kiddos, just being able to explain anxiety and what we can do about it, working up through strategies for intermediate age kids up through teenagers. One of my absolute favorite books, What to Do When You Worry Too Much. I think that's a really good book for kids that are in that like 7, 8, 9, 10, like kind of that middle range, 11, where it's really good education about anxiety and what to do when it's happening. And now we will do some questions.
So we do have a few questions that were sent in with everybody who was registering. So the first question that I would love our panelists to answer is is there any way to teach your child how to self-advocate at school in order to decrease their anxiety?
Yeah, I think that's a great question because ultimately we want them to be able to talk about it with other people and have some sort of plan of action for them to engage in themselves. And I think a big part of that can be practicing together. So if they're like, what if they say this? Okay, well, we can talk about that. That's totally cool. That's a great question. And you can even, if they're still worried about it, you can even lay out a script for them and how they can talk about it as well. And then you can encourage that they practice some strategies that are really calming for them before they try and self-advocate for themselves, whether that be some deep breathing, some fidget toys, whatever works for them. And then that helps them regulate themselves before they try and self-advocate as well. And then along with practicing together, talking about what their needs are exactly, because we might have one idea or thought as far as like, hey, I've noticed this is happening. Like, it's not a big deal. And so just talking through it and getting that collaboration is a really great idea.
Yeah, I think you bring up such a good point of like practicing it with your child so that they get some kind of reps in, as well as like just some modeling too, if needed, where they can kind of see how you would handle it. Dr. Reeve, were you going to share something?
I think that, sometimes too, even giving a child like a stepping stone strategy can be helpful. So maybe they have, a note card they set on the corner of their desk when they're feeling worried or nervous, or there's some sort of like signal, between the child and the teacher. So, the more we can give them discrete ways and then work up can sometimes be pretty beneficial too.
Absolutely. I love the idea. Having that visual reminder could be really helpful, especially when you're starting to feel a little anxious.
Yep, for sure.
Yeah. Okay. I think our next question was maybe just some strategies for getting out of bed in the morning. I know I was struggling with that this morning.
Definitely. Yeah, that's a thing for me too, for sure. Yeah, and I think part of it is just making sure that they have really good foundation with their sleep in general and making sure that the night before went as well as possible and they're sleeping in the dark, they're sleeping by themselves, and then also trying to tackle some of the things that can overwhelm you in the morning, do them at night. And so you can take a shower at night, you can set out your clothes, you can go ahead and have your lunch ready to go. So that way you're not sitting there like, oh my God, I have to do this and this and this and this and this and this. So you can shorten that to-do list a little bit and that can help some. And I think also just focusing on some of those small steps like we talked about, like what's something that's getting in that direction, but like sitting up in bed first and allowing that time to gradually wake up even. You can even open up the curtains a little bit for some natural light and get your body starting to be regulated a little bit. And you can play some fun music to lighten the mood too. So you're like, okay, I got a group going on. I can get into this morning thing. It can be fun too.
Yeah, I do love that. And I love the idea too of that checklist that can be something to help kind of aid in falling asleep, which would probably help in getting up out of bed in the morning. I love that point. And I see that there's some questions on the slide, so I also don't want to take away from your order. So feel free to jump to the questions too that make most sense.
You're totally good. So this is one that I was going to answer next. So really this comes back to what can I do to help my child with their anxiety, and how do we build connections to our children? And I think that this can be tough depending on the age. It might be a little easier with a younger kiddo, but as we approach the teenage years, there can be a lot of barriers to communication that just happen as a function of age. But I really think the key is just telling your child that you're there for them, that you care about them, and you've noticed maybe something feels a little bit off. So just giving them the opportunity to be able to talk, and just, them knowing that you've noticed something, can just open up a window of opportunity to be able to start a conversation. A strategy that I use a lot, because I think, sometimes teenagers can, automatically assume that you're going to say, oh, when I was younger, this is what I would do when I was your age. I think that's the dreaded response by teenagers when they're talking about their feelings. And so, I like to, have a conversation with parents and teens and say, it's okay to let me know what you want out of this conversation. So I want the teenager to let the parent know, I just need you to listen right now, so that they know, like, I don't want problem solving. I don't want you to fix it. I just want you to listen to what's going on. And, if there is, some confusion, or the teenager maybe wants some advice or input from their parent, then they could say, hey, like, can you help me figure out what's going on? So I think direct, clear communication, and starting that as early as you can really build that trust that we really need when kids are talking about their emotions. So that's more on the teenager side. But I think with younger kids, even just spending time with them doing things they like to do, so building Legos or drawing, coloring, you would be surprised what kids start to talk about if you're just hanging out and spending time together. And even just modeling, talking about your own feelings can be a way to get a child to talk about their own feelings too.
I love all of that too. It was also just making me think about, like, when a parent, or like when a child's feeling a little elevated or anxious, one way that we can connect with them as parents is really practicing the strategies with them, as they're feeling anxious, or even like before, right? Like when we're not anxious, just practicing it with them. That's one way that might help with some of that kind of that connection when they're feeling a little worried or a little anxious.
Yeah, I totally agree. I feel like the better we are at these strategies when we're calm, the more effective we can be at using them when we
Yes.
have a high level of anxiety. So maybe we're going to practice deep breathing every night before bed, or, you pick
Mm.
a coping skill we want to practice. So you can even turn it into something, fun like that you're both doing together, that makes it a part of your routine. So I'll move on to this other question. So this is the last one of the submitted questions that we'll talk about, and then we can see if there are any from tonight. So this question is, what are tools schools can use to help parents when their child is experiencing school refusal? So this question is more like, what can we do as a school to help support parents? I think, just making sure that the parent maybe understands exactly what school refusal is. And so, a lot of the educational pieces that we talked about this evening, just making sure that a parent understands that, to the best of, how the school can explain that. And just letting the parent know that they're not alone, and that the school and the family and, various other professionals can certainly work together to be able to come up with an effective solution. I think sometimes, if there's a problem, parents, don't necessarily feel comfortable, communicating with the school right away, because maybe they want to fix it on their own. But, the sooner that we can work on these things, the easier it is to correct. Because the goal is to be at school as much as possible when we have concerns about school refusal. And so that, what can we do to make that happen? And I think the key, like I said, is just that supportive communication.
Yeah, I feel like with some of this is really just being sure that everybody's on the same page. We all have a plan that we're all agreeing to. That can just be really helpful to make sure that it's very predictable for the child too. that can do a lot to help out.
Because if the child knows what the plan, the teacher knows what the plan, and the parent knows, everybody can be encouraging and
Yes,
reinforcing all of the steps the child is trying to make to get through that anxiety.
exactly. Yeah. Dr. Ackley, anything else you wanted to add to that?
No, I just agree, just making sure that everybody's on the same page is like the biggest component of that, and identifying, what the plan can be, what's working at home, what's working at school, because
Yeah,
that collaboration is so helpful.
absolutely.
And I guess just my overall, take home with this is that if we have anxiety, the most important piece is to not escape or avoid, because that is going to amplify anxiety, more than it even was at the beginning, because it builds up that anxiety in your brain so much that the fear becomes even greater. And so
Mhm.
if we, just have an open conversation with our kids of like, this might be hard. This might be a tough thing to do to try to work through this worry that you have, but we want you to be in control and not to allow that anxiety to take over and be the one that's in control.
Such a good point. I feel like sometimes anxiety can like rule our lives. And by kind of standing up to it, it can be super empowering. I even think about like if a child is having like a difficult time, maybe feeling like obviously it's not going to be super motivating to do something that's like really anxiety provoking, but something that could be helpful is even talking about like, have you been worried about something in the past, but you did it anyways? And then what happened? How did you feel afterwards? That can be one way without actually approaching the anxiety in that moment could be a way for them to remember, wait, I've done something like this before, and actually I turned out to be okay. Like everything was okay. That could be one way to kind of start that conversation about the benefits of doing the anxiety provoking thing.
Yeah, and I think they can use that information too whenever they're having those anxiety provoking thoughts and they're getting so many anxiety kind of thoughts and so many worries going through their heads. That can be a moment where they're like, okay, let me think about another time where I've encountered this, but I was able to go to school that day, or I was able to talk to this person, even though I was really, really worried about it, and it didn't seem quite as bad. Or maybe it was tough, and that's okay, but you still were able to go through it.
I like to use the example of learning how to ride a bike, because I think that there is like, oh, what if I fall? Or, what if I can't get my balance? I feel like there are so many what ifs when we're trying to learn a new skill like that, that I think, especially for younger kids, if we can use an example of like, okay, like, remember you did so well learning how to ride your bike. It took some work, but now you're just like zooming around the neighborhood. So if we can have something like fun like that to reference, I think that that's, a really good way to approach it too.
I love that idea. I might have to use that.
Yeah.
Alrighty. Well, if there's no more questions, we would really, really like to thank our presenters, Dr. Reeve and Dr. Ackley, for joining us tonight and for presenting all of that awesome information and answering those really thoughtful questions. In the chat, you'll see an exit ticket or an exit survey. It takes just a few minutes just to let us know what you thought about today's webinar, so that we can continue to kind of improve all of our processes. So please feel free, or please complete that so that we can take your feedback. But thank you so much for joining us on a Thursday evening. We hope that your weekend is restful, and please reach out with any questions that you have. Thank you so much, everyone.